Good morning, everybody. This is another edition of the Castball Show brought to you by JohnPLA.com, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a handful of stuff we're going to get into today in the world of baseball, sports, and unifying America. And as we are getting closer, hopefully, for the start of new sports, new seasons, continued seasons that we want to see completed. Looks like hockey's going to be the first, followed by basketball. Thinking about the prospects of having a Major League Baseball season. And I think the easiest thing to do is to be optimistic about it and say, hey, if hockey is going to start again, if basketball is going to start again, then the Major League Baseball season should be right behind it, if not before it or at the forefront of it. But unfortunately, what you're seeing happen, and it's led by the commissioner. And let's be serious, there's always two ways you can look at it. You could look at it from the argument of millionaires battling with billionaires over money, or you could look at a commissioner, number one, trying to make a name for himself, trying to put himself in the likes of the best commissioners ever, trying to put him in a place where he is going to get enshrined in a baseball's Hall of Fame. And that's what Rob Manfred is kind of looking like right now. He wants to be the one to change what the players and the Players Association have changed for years. And here's the one reason that I am siding with the players when it comes to this discussion. I think 2022, we are headed towards a major breakup, a major strike in Major League Baseball. I think we have a long way to go between the players and the owners before they can agree on simple terms and what is fair and what is not fair. But if you look back at what has happened since the abolishment of the reserve clause in the late 1970s, there has been owners who have wanted to change this. Free agency, which has gone in the way of the players, which we could all agree, and we could all agree that maybe it's gone too much into the players' favor. It led to the strike in 1981, the split season, the whole thing, the 1994 player strike, which I remember writing about when I was in college. The bitterness that ended up costing a full season in 1994. And what's happening right now is we are not that far away from having the same thing happen. 26 years later, the owners are still looking to get control back from the players. And they are looking in each situation to take back more power. And they did that in the last collective bargaining agreement. So the fact exists that the players and the owners have collectively bargained that if there's a shortened season, maybe for some unforeseen thing, and obviously nobody could predict the coronavirus and how it was going to impact the entire world, let alone this country, that if there was something unforeseen that was going to shorten the length of the baseball season, the players were going to be paid on a prorated basis. In other words, if there was not 162 games in a baseball season, the players would be paid their full salary over the course of 162 games, but it's subtracted to make it prorated. If they played 81 games, that means they'd get half of what their pay would be over the course of the season. This was collectively bargained. This was put into writing. Both the owners and the Players Association were in agreement at these terms. So this is why I'm siding with the players here. Now you can side with the owners. The owners have been screwed for years. Since the Seitz decision and the start of free agency, many owners have been forced to get out of baseball. Charlie Finley was forced to sell the Athletics because he could not afford to pay the players' salaries. And many owners realized that it was a different type of business. But now, 20 years go by, 30 years go by, since 76? And an owner of a Major League Baseball team understands what it is that their responsibility is. Whatever wealth that they have, whatever money it costs them to purchase the franchise, regardless of it, there's a certain amount of money that has to be allocated to pay the players' salaries. And you're talking about, in most cases, billionaires that are making money Whether it's revenue sharing, whether it's TV deals, whether it's the fact that they're an owner of a Major League Baseball team in a large market. All of this gives them the opportunity to earn, and part of their job as the owner is to allocate a portion of their earnings to pay the players' salaries. And one of the biggest divides that exist in baseball, and this frustrates me too, because there's no TV deal that makes sure is shared amongst all the different teams in baseball. The closest thing you could say is the revenue sharing, where some of the larger market teams end up giving money for some of the smaller market teams. But a small market city, as we hit what we'll call the midway point here at a Pass Ball Show, the opening point, the closing point, whatever you want to call it. Just a reminder, Pass Ball Show brought to you by JohnPielli.com, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So hopefully I didn't lose my train of thought that much, but you're looking at owners that are required to pay a certain amount of money towards payroll. Now, I've advocated before, and I know this is not a popular thing when it comes to the players, but the institution of some sort of salary cap to be held in conjunction with that of a salary floor. And I think one has to go with the other because, listen, players, why do you want to have a salary cap? Yeah, the luxury tax exists to penalize teams that are over. And obviously you can tell owners are feeling it in the pockets because less and less teams are getting to a point where they're willing to go above and beyond over the luxury tax threshold. And those that do are doing it on a calculated basis where they're getting themselves ready. All right, a couple off seasons from now, we'll blow over it, but in the meantime, we're going to try to keep ourselves under it. So, in fact, it is kind of functioning as a salary cap. And if I'm the Players Association, I get with the players and the owners and say, listen, let's put together a salary cap, but have it in conjunction with a salary floor, which is going to force the cheap teams and the cheap ownerships like the Marlins and the Rays and the Athletics and the Indians and the Pirates to have a certain amount of money allocated towards payroll. And I think this would change a lot. It would keep the teams that are trying to use the semantics of their payroll and be able to manipulate it by paying their players less, by profiting as an organization, and not necessarily caring about winning or losing. And compare that to that in the NFL. You got the Jacksonvilles, you got the Tennessees, you got the small market areas of National Football League cities that you figured would be struggling. You figured would not be able to compete with the likes of the New Yorks and the Los Angeleses and the Bostons and the Philadelphias and the Dallases. The teams with deeper pockets. But that's not true. The TV deals allow for all the teams in the National Football League to be on a competitive and the same type of floor. It's because of the salary cap, but also as the salary cap has existed in the National Football League for several years, the salary cap is becoming a number. New owners are taking over National Football League teams and they're understanding that if they're going to own a team, they're going to have to allocate this amount of their funds to pay their players. Baseball, if you're an owner, you could say, hey, I could save a lot of money by paying my players as a whole $20 million. If I have deeper pockets, if I'm on a larger market, if I'm the Steinbrenner family, if I'm the Lerner family, and I have the ability to pay the players whatever it is that I want, we could go above and beyond. We could pay $230 million, $250 million, but you shouldn't have teams in the same sport that have $20 million payrolls and have $250 million payrolls. Something's got to change there. And the thing that should change is the salary cap held in conjunction with a salary floor. You want to set that salary floor at, I don't know, 75 million, 80 million, 90 million. I think the higher the better, but you have to get something that's agreed upon between the players and the owners. So the long-winded point that I've got into when it comes to baseball being restored at some point is the divide that exists between the owners and the players. There are owners that are looking back at their forefathers, and very few generations of teams have held within the same family. You know about the Steinbrenners, who obviously go back to the 70s. John Henry with the Red Sox has not been there ridiculously long. Obviously, the Yawkey family for the Red Sox for years. The Mets with the Wilpons since 1980. So there's a little bit of an old guard that says, hey, in the 70s, the owners had the control. Going back before that, there was this thing called the reserve clause that basically called the player to a team as property. That team owned the rights to the player, and if they couldn't agree on a contract number, it was basically a take it or leave it thing. The owner would say, hey, this is what we're going to pay you. If you don't want that, then you could go not play. There was no free agency. Now, with the advent of free agency, there became a supply and demand for player services. And obviously, we know how we went from one end talking about almost kind of a property type of situation with players as they were controlled by their owners, to the other side where the players were essentially dictating the salaries, now are being paid by owners. Now, the last part I just said, being paid by owners, in the end, there's an owner that has to approve of this contract. A contract that's put together, an owner has to say, listen, I am willing to pay this. So I'm not willing to let them off the hook. If they were willing to allow salaries to escalate as much as they did, all it takes is one owner to say, hey, I'll pay that. And I'm not saying they had to work in collusion together like they did in the 1980s. But when you agree to pay a player $30 million a year, I don't feel bad for the owner that's chalking up that kind of money. Now, it does, if one player gets paid that, the other player is going to say, hey, listen, I'm as good, if not better. Over time, the better paid players kind of depreciate over time. Some of the younger players end up becoming the new guard and the next, whoever. And because of that, they, create a demand. And so you look at, hey, this player got paid this amount of money. I'm the best player in the sport right now. I should get paid more than that. At some point, if there's no team that's willing to pay that, then that player has to take what the best offer is, assuming we're talking about free agency. But you're seeing something that has escalated out of control, and I can understand up to a point that the owners and the commissioner obviously is in charge of the owners. He's the speaking voice of the owners. I understand the frustration. But maybe instead of taking that player that says, hey, you know what, no player's ever been paid $50 million a season. You know what, if every owner says, I'm not going to pay that, then a player will never make $50 million in a season. But to try to take back, which is looks like this is what the owners are trying to do, basically telling players, hey, the more you get paid, the more of a pay cut you're going to receive. And how does this apply to the minor leaguers? Because this is one of the things that's really frustrating me. You look at the minor league baseball players who, many are out of work right now. Sure, a handful of them are going to get paid whatever it is, that $400 a week stipend that they're going to get till the rest of the season. But in the end, what is it for? If we're not going to have baseball, we're certainly not going to have a minor league season. And I know the focus is on a Major League Baseball season. It's going to come at the extent of the thousands and thousands of minor league players that are out there. And this is coming pretty much with the backdrop of what the commissioner has been trying to do, and that's eliminate a series of minor league baseball teams. And listen, are all of them warranted? Do we have too many minor league teams as we finish the 2019 season? Yes. Should we reduce some of them? Should we get rid of a couple small leagues and small affiliates? I think so. But to drop, 60-something minor league baseball teams is a shot at the players and a shot at the sport. And to say that the minor league season as it exists this year is completely irrelevant, it's not good for baseball either. Now, it's hard. If you're going to have baseball held at ballparks with no fans, you almost can't have a minor league season because minor league baseball teams rely on the revenue that they make from ticket sales. They may not charge a lot for ticket sales, but they're looking, whether it's tickets that they're giving away or tickets that they're getting from local residents that live within the area. they're looking to pocket every last bit of that to support their operating expenses. So I understand. If you're going to have no fans there, it's not like you can turn on TV and watch a double-A game between, the two top teams. It's not like you watch a South Atlantic League game between, the Jupiter team in Port St. Lucie. Even on the local fronts, if you live in those areas, it's unlikely you'll be able to watch those games on TV. So it's understandable. Now, St. Aloysius Church, once again, for the second straight Sunday, is going to be administering Holy Communion outside its church located at 935 Bennett Mills Road in Jackson, New Jersey, after the 10 a.m. virtual Mass. Now, the 10 a.m. virtual Mass means just that. It's held on the internet. You look up their YouTube channel, St. Aloysius Church of Jackson, New Jersey. They have a virtual service, 5 p.m. on Saturday and 10:30 a.m. on Sunday. So at the conclusion of the virtual Mass, outside of their church, which means you're watching the Mass from wherever, whether it's home, whether it's in your car, you head over to the church. They will guide you in the parking lot where there will be priests on either side of the car ready to administer Holy Communion. Should start around 11:30 a.m. And last week it lasted about 25 minutes or so. So there was a nice turnout. They gave out over 400, to 400 people. So I think that was a great job. I look forward to it again this week. 935 Bennett Mills Road, St. Aloysius Church in Jackson, New Jersey, will be giving out Holy Communion at the conclusion of its 10:30 a.m. virtual Mass on Sunday, which will be the 31st of May, 2020. So I put this up on Twitter, a little bit of a poll on what you would think is the biggest upset in the history of the World Series in baseball. And I want to do another one when it applies to football. I'm going to do another one as it applies to basketball and hockey. You can think of, as much a passionate fan as you are, the World Series winners in baseball. And like I said, we'll do it as it applies to football and basketball and hockey over the course of the next couple weeks. But what team won the World Series that you look back on and you're like, I can't believe that team won? There's more that come to the forefront than we think. And there's one that I think is very much superior to others that doesn't get spoken about. I'm going to put another blog post up about it because I don't believe a lot of people understand the backdrop of what was happening at this time with this particular team. But the first group that I put together was four. It was the 2006 Cardinals, the 1955 Dodgers, the 1964 Cardinals, and the 2001 Diamondbacks. At this point, it looks like the Diamondbacks, according to the poll, are running away with it. And I think it's true. I think the Diamondbacks beating that mighty Yankee team that had just won 3 straight World Series and was up 3-2, looked like the superior team. And looked like here we go again, especially with the backdrop of what was happening with 9/11 and the World Trade Center and the whole thing. All the respect going to everybody that risked their lives and everybody that was supporting and helping the city of New York. It seemed fitting that the New York Yankees would win the World Series that year in 2001, and the Diamondbacks won themselves Game 6. Had a very highly contested Game 7 that came down to the last inning and Mariano Rivera holding on to a 1-run lead. So yes, I get it. Out of these 4 teams, the Arizona Diamondbacks were the biggest upset out of the 4. 2006 Cardinals, 83 wins during the regular season. They beat the Padres in the NLCS. They took care of the Mets. In the NLDS for the Padres. The NLCS with the Mets in a highly contested 7-game series. Matched up against the Tigers team in Detroit. It was on its way up. Looked like it had some talent. Had a better regular season than the St. Louis Cardinals did. And they won in 5 games. So yeah, I think that's a little bit of an upset. Now I look at the 1964 Cardinals, and I don't think that they get thought of along this line of being an upset team as much. Especially in this list, because I would go with them over the 1955 Dodgers, and I'll tell you why in a brief second. 1964 Cardinals, we're getting ready for the offseason. Johnny Keane was set to be fired at the end of the season for the St. Louis Cardinals. They were looking to go in a different direction. It was time for a change in St. Louis. And all of a sudden, the Phillies collapsed at a time where the St. Louis Cardinals were playing good baseball. And all of a sudden, the Cardinals overtake the Phillies and win the National League. And then they set themselves up against a mighty New York Yankee team, a team that was heading to the World Series for the 5th consecutive season. They were certainly the favorites. And the fact that the Cardinals beat the Yankees led to, of course, Johnny Keane leaving the Cardinals because he was going to be out anyway and joining the New York Yankees as their next manager after Yogi Berra was fired and let go after the World Series. So I think the 64 Cardinals are a little more of an upset in the World Series than the 55 Dodgers. I get it. If you're a 55 Dodgers fan, if you're looking back and you remember the 1941 Dodgers, 47 Dodgers, 49 Dodgers, 52 Dodgers, and 53 Dodgers, all teams made it to the World Series against the mighty New York Yankees, and the Yankees won every single time. But I think this 1955 team, you can make a case, was the best team that was put together. The one that had built up some postseason and World Series experience. The one that had some of the best players in the game. And one that was ready to beat the New York Yankees like they did in Game 7 on October 4th, 1955. So, yes, was it a surprise that the Dodgers finally beat the Yankees? Was it great for the city of Brooklyn and New York to celebrate the Dodgers finally overcoming the mighty New York Yankees? Yes. I don't think it was an upset, though. So the next group that I got into, talking about the 1988 Dodgers, who you've probably seen the documentary about Kirk Gibson, the whole thing, the 1990 Reds, the 1966 Baltimore Orioles, and the 2003 Miami Marlins. And I think this one turned out to be just about as tight as it should have been. The Dodgers with 37% of the vote, the Marlins with 33.3% of the vote, the Reds with 20%, and even the Orioles of 1966 getting 9.3% of the vote. So I thought this was pretty good. I thought there was a lot more thought put behind these four teams than any of the other groups that I ended up putting together. And I think I would give the edge personally to the Florida Marlins of 2003, because I look at that Marlins team. It was young. Jack McKeon took over as manager midway through the season. They looked like they needed a little bit of a change. They looked like they were rebuilding. This was a team that ended up not winning the National League East. They made it through the playoffs, beat the Cubs in that ridiculous game with the Steve Bartman fly ball and Moises Alou, the whole thing. And as they're matched up against the mighty New York Yankees of 2003, I look back at this and I don't see it. I don't see the Marlins being able to win this series when it starts out. I look at the Marlins and I think if this team somehow stays intact, which obviously we know it didn't, this could be a really good team for a long time. That this shouldn't be their only chance at the World Series. They should have an opportunity to win multiple World Series. But the average age of the players, their lack of experience, and the fact that their manager, Jack McKeon, who had taken over during the regular season, had no track record of being a World Series winning manager. So I think the Marlins beating the Yankees that year in 6 games was the biggest upset out of the 4. Now, slightly better than the Dodgers of 1988. Now, remember the Dodgers of 1988, not thought to be a really good team. 86, 87 were bad seasons, but, boo-hoo. You look at the Dodgers, who were good through that entire decade in the 1980s. Won the World Series in 1981, got back to the postseason in 83 and 85. 88, obviously, we're talking about a little bit of a different team coming off of 2 bad seasons. That I agree. Now, the Dodgers go out there in a regular season, and they're essentially wire to wire. They lead the division. They play some very good baseball. They end up winning the division. Nobody's disputing why the Dodgers are in the playoffs at this point. But here's where it becomes a little bit of an underdog story. Here's where you talk about the Dodgers and you say it's a little bit of an upset. They're matched up against the 1988 New York Mets, a team that had beat them 10 out of 11 times during the regular season. And the Dodgers end up winning in 7 games. Now, listen, they're doing the majority of it off the back of Oral Hershiser, who if we're going to rank best seasons by a starting pitcher in baseball history, you got to put Orioles' 1988 performance, that entire season and the playoffs, up there. I mean, he basically carried that team, a team that suffered through some injuries, a team that obviously had a very, difficult and compromised Kirk Gibson, who was their best player. He won the MVP in the National League that year. And as they get to the World Series, you look at the mighty Oakland Athletics, a team that was thought to be there for the first time for many years. And listen, they had a very good run after that. The Oakland Athletics on paper look like they're much better than that Los Angeles Dodgers team. So you can make a case, 2003 Marlins, 1988 Dodgers, the matchups of the World Series, I thought they were pretty similar. I agree with it. I give the slight edge to the 2003 Marlins. The 1990 Reds, now listen, they were wire-to-wire winners. They were a team that pretty much just gelled together and became great overnight. They earned everything they got, playing a similar Oakland Athletic team, maybe a better Oakland Athletic team, because the 90 Athletics have Ricky Henderson, the 88 Athletics don't. I think it's a little bit of an upset, but the Reds took it to them. They showed that they were the better team in that series. They beat up the Athletics. They earned their World Series championship. I can't look back at that and say it was as much of an upset as the 88 Dodgers or the 2003 Florida Marlins. Now, the 66 Orioles are interesting, but they have the Frank Robinson factor. Frank Robinson coming over from the Cincinnati Reds that offseason, basically traded when the general manager said Frank Robinson is an old 30, basically saying that he's towards the end of his career. He goes out there, he has one of his best seasons. That Orioles team played with a chip on its shoulder, led by Frank Robinson. So I look back on it, and I don't think that team was as much of an upset. Yes, they beat a very good Los Angeles Dodgers team with Sandy Koufax, his last year, the whole thing. Now, the Orioles had some very good pitching. The Orioles' pitching is what kind of carried them through the series, but their pitching, Frank Robinson, I can't say that that was a bigger upset than the other three that I had mentioned. Now, the last grouping that I had was the 1914 Boston Braves, the 1969 New York Mets, the 1960 Pittsburgh Pirates, and the 1920 Cleveland Indians. And I'm going to go in my reverse order of fourth biggest upset to biggest upset, and I'm going to tell you why. The 1920 Cleveland Indians were a story that if you don't know, if you haven't researched, if nobody told you about it, a team that was kind of centered around one player, which ended up losing his life during the regular season. Ray Chapman, their shortstop, was killed after he was struck in the head by a fastball thrown by Carl Mays of the New York Yankees. And the unfortunate thing about that is, it was a dirty ball. Obviously led to a change in rules in baseball to make the balls cleaner, maybe easier to be controlled by the pitcher. But the bottom line is you're talking about a player that comes up there, gets struck with a very hard-thrown fastball in his head, and ends up dying. He ends up being killed. And the Indians kind of use it as a rally cry. Led by Tris Speaker, their manager, they go out there, they beat the Dodgers in the 1920 World Series. And if you look back at the time, yes, the Bostons were good. Yankees were kind of coming up. You're talking about Babe Ruth's first season there. There were probably better suited options as far as American League teams to represent them in a World Series. But I do think they got a little help from God, a little help from their fate and prayers for their deceased ball player. And they went out there and won themselves a World Series championship. Now, I look at the 1960 Pirates and I say, this was a good baseball team. This was a team that you could probably say was the best team in the National League. I don't have any issue with it. I don't think it's worth, saying, hey, this team doesn't belong. Roberto Clemente, you look at some of the greats on that team, Danny Murtaugh, a great manager. This was a team that deserved to be in the World Series. The problem and the reason that it's looked back on as such an upset is the mighty New York Yankees, a team that had the ability with their offense to just bludgeon any sort of pitching that they were going up there against. So the Pirates pitching and the Yankees offense really were no match for each other. The Yankees, in the games that they won going away. And it comes down to Game 7 one of the best played World Series games in the history of baseball, and one that happened to be played at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. And to me, that was the difference in the Pirates winning the World Series and the Yankees winning the World Series. The fact that the Pirates had last licks, and somehow, the Yankees allowed the Pirates to go into their last at-bat with the score tied. Bill Mazeroski hits the home run off of Ralph Terry, and we know it goes in the history of baseball lore. Now, were the Pirates a better team on paper than the 1960 New York Yankees? Many people will say no, but once again, that's why they play the games. The Pirates beat the Yankees. Now, the 1969 Mets, especially in the city of New York, the fans of New York City, and anybody that's been a Mets fan, understands that the Mets, as their underdog and their underdog status, would come into that 69 season. Nobody was thinking that they were competing for a World Series championship. This was a team in its first 7 seasons, had finished last place every year. In 1968, finished in 9th out of 10 teams. So this was a team that, hey, may be on its way. Gil Hodges had a good pulse of that team. That team was going to improve a little bit. Maybe they're expecting to win more games than they lose for the first time in history. But at that point, nobody's expecting them to go out there and win the World Series championship. So I get it. Biggest underdog story in the history of baseball. You want to say is the Mets? That's fine. But I'm going to throw ignorance your way and say that you're saying that just because you don't know the story of the 1914 Boston Braves. And I'm going to write about it again. We'll put out another story. Maybe a couple people will read it. Maybe they won't. I don't really care. But the 1914 Boston Braves are the biggest upset in the history of the World Series. And I get it. If you haven't seen it before, if you know no footage exists from this World Series, all you have is history books and the internet, Wikipedia. If you want to look up the 1914 baseball season, maybe you'll learn a couple things that you didn't know. And if you're not that diehard of a baseball fan, then you're not going to look it up. You're not going to care about the results of what happened that season and what made the Boston Braves the biggest unexpected World Series champion. This was a team that didn't have a whole lot of star power. Johnny Evers was their second baseman. If you know of the poem Tinker Evers to Chance, he was the second baseman of the Chicago Cubs. Had won a couple World Series in 1907 and 1908 with that franchise. He was their star player. Hank Gowdy, the catcher, had a great World Series. He is known for actually being the only Major League Baseball player to be in active duty in both World War I and World War II. The Braves took advantage of the Giants and the Dodgers and the Reds and the Phillies and the Cardinals. All teams who seemed to be beating up each other were several games out of the National League in 1914 with the month of August about to start. They go on this ridiculous run. They end up winning the National League pennant over some teams that you could say on paper were probably superior. But here's the part that's going to put them over the top. You talk about the 69 Mets and the mighty Baltimore Orioles. Yes, the Orioles had won the World Series in 1966, had returned a lot of the same players to that 1969 team. Earl Weaver, the manager. You think that they would be favorited over the Mets, and they were. But they were nowhere as near favorite as the Philadelphia Athletics were playing the Boston Braves in 1914. The Philadelphia Athletics with Connie Mack, the $100,000 infield, star pitchers Chief Bender, Eddie Plank, probably had to have the most ridiculous odds to win the World Series championship in their favor. The Athletics had won the World Series in 1910, 1911, and 1913. We're looking to win for the 4th time in 5 years. Going up against a Braves team that didn't necessarily stumble there, but overcame a very big deficit to get to the World Series. You looked at the Athletics team in this hand, you looked at the Braves team in this hand. That Athletics team was so much more athletic, so much deeper, so much superior to that of the Boston Braves. So the World Series comes. Not only do the Braves win, but the Braves sweep. Biggest upset, World Series history. Throw something back at me to prove me wrong. The other thing about it, which I will write about and I've written about a couple times, is the conspiracy theory that should exist with that 1914 Boston Brave team, not to a fault of them, but to the fault of the Philadelphia Athletics, who may have had some bitterness and animosity towards their manager and owner, Connie Mack. There was a lot of bitterness and anxiety that existed amongst players at that time. Players were not paid that much money. Players were offered bonuses that were taken away, almost like that whole Indian giver. Here, you take this, now I'm taking it back. The owners treated the players as property. 1919 Chicago White Sox. Enough to get the team to rally around each other, not to win the World Series, but to conspire to throw the World Series to gamblers. Were gamblers ruling baseball at that time? Absolutely. I just don't think there's enough media attention in 1914 to be able to unearth anything that could have happened that would make the statement that that series was not played on a level. Did the 1914 Philadelphia Athletics throw the World Series? And I'm not sure. They may have. They may not have. But if you look at Connie Mack and the dissension that was held amongst the players, when it was made pretty clear that Connie Mack was not looking to keep this team together long term, the team would essentially have its star players traded away the next couple seasons. 1917, the Philadelphia Athletics had one of the worst seasons in all of Major League Baseball history. Were the players that disgusted that they could have thrown the World Series? And if so, how about the breach that existed at that time to not have anybody speak up at that time to say that something was not on a level? You talk about 5-year difference between 1914 and 1919. Obviously, there's a more attention put towards the media. But I would say there's a chance that the 1914 World Series was won by the Boston Braves because the Philadelphia Athletics threw the series. A little bit of a recap of the show today, and as always, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This is the Passball Show brought to you by St. Aloysius Church and School of Jackson, New Jersey, by Two Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and of course, JohnPielli.com. So thinking about the prospects of baseball getting back for another season, I think we're getting there when it comes to hockey. Expect to hear a date soon. Expect to hear basketball with some sort of plan. But baseball, it seems the owners and the players are at each other's throats again. And the reason that I'm siding with the players, and I said this earlier, is because the owners and the players had an agreement in their collective bargaining agreement between the players and the owners that if there was anything that was going to compromise the amount of games played in the season, the players were entitled to a prorated portion of their salaries. Now, the owners may be producing documents to say why they're going to lose so much more money, and maybe that's something that could be brought up. Hey, the owners say, hey, with no fans in attendance, we're going to be losing so much more money than before, and we can't afford to absorb it all on the chin. But my thought and my fear is that this is something that the owners have tried to wrestle away power from the players since the Peter Seitz decision of 1976. And if we're still dealing with this garbage, that the owners are pissed off that the players have gained so much power, which, by the way, players are only getting paid the amount of money that the owners are willing to pay them. One owner out there is paying the player what they're getting. I look at it and I just think this is a terrible way to do this. If you're going to risk not having baseball because the owners are trying to take more from the players, like they did in 1981 when the baseball players went on strike, like they did in 1994 when it cost the league its postseason and World Series, like you've seen in the 1980s when it comes to collusion with owners trying to dictate how much players are going to make when it comes to salaries, when it's happened with owners trying to dictate exactly how much money they're going to be paying their players and saying, hey, we're going to put $20 million and that's going to be our entire payroll, when other teams are out there spending $250 million. We could be a small market team because we choose to. Instead of owners saying, listen, part of our business expense is to pay players a certain amount of money. And that's why a salary cap would be beneficial, not just for the owners, but for the players. If there's a salary cap with and held in conjunction with a salary floor, you'll get payrolls up, but you'll also get them steady. And I think it's important that you think about the of what is important. And that's a balance with the players and the owners, but it's also a balance of a competitive playing field when it comes to how each team is going to have a similar opportunity. You look at the National Football League, there's revenue sharing amongst the TV deals, which allows the smaller market teams to make the same sort of revenue as the large market teams. There's no disparity between Jacksonville and Dallas. There's no disparity between Tennessee and New York because of the size of the markets. But it exists in baseball because there's no salary cap, but also because there's no salary floor. And I think it's something that's frustrating, but I cannot side with the owners who are trying to push their own personal agenda. I cannot side with a commissioner that is basically trying to make a name for himself, trying to empower himself for the owners, trying to punch himself a ticket into Cooperstown and Baseball Hall of Fame at some point. This is not the time for it. This is the time to get together, pay the players what they're supposed to be paid, a prorated portion of their salaries, and get back and play baseball. Talk about some of the biggest World Series upsets in the history of the sport. We'll talk about Super Bowls and football next week. This is the Passball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, by St. Aloysius Church and School in Jackson, New Jersey, by 2 Ways, One Passion Food Truck located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. God bless you. And as always, I see you on the other side.